My presentation will focus more on the second aspect of opportunities for the left. In particular, potential strategies for building an alternative to neoliberalism. Now, a recurrent idea in the left is that in the foreseeable future, that is in the coming decades, our goal should not be thinking about a new socialist system, but it should be to establish and maintain a social democratic capitalism. So, at least in the foreseeable future, in the coming decades, we shouldn't frame the issue as capitalism versus socialism, but it should be simply to obtain this social democratic capitalism. Now, if we think about socialism, right, as if we define socialism as a participatory planned economy, or as an economy where workers appropriate the surplus democratically, or as a non-alienated economy, well, getting from here to there seems reasonably unlikely in the coming decades. Now, framing the issue this way implicitly sees socialism as a static system. Instead, as authors such as David Laitman have argued, we should see socialism as a dynamic transition process. So, for example, Laitman argues we should see the socialist transition as one of consisting of three stages: precursor socialism, mature socialism, and communism. Now, precursor socialism would be immediately after capitalism, and thus it would have different institutional arrangements around the world depending on the time period or the particular conditions in the country when they arrived at this precursor socialism. Now, this idea is not necessarily new. In fact, Che Guevara also proposed the three stages model, or a three stages understanding of the transition process. So Che Guevara argued there was a first period of construction, and after the first period of construction, you had socialism, and then afterwards communism. Now, the idea again is that this first period of construction will most likely have different institutional variations across the world, depending on particular conditions. Thus, Soviet-style planning, a regulated market economy of worker co-ops, or even a radical social democratic welfare state with a high presence of worker co-ops or state-managed enterprise could all be conceived as a first period of construction that could potentially move towards socialism later on. Now, there is a fundamental difference between resigning to social democratic reforms as the only realistic option and conceiving them as a first step in the direction of the socialist transition. Now, this will most likely give a different character to what we struggle for in the present. Now, given this dynamic understanding of the socialist transition, the question is, what is to be done? How do we initiate this socialist transition, or this first move towards the first period of construction? Eric Olin Wright develops a useful framework to evaluate the different options currently on the table. He argues that there are three main transition logics or strategies. The first he calls the ruptural strategy, which he associates to the revolutionary socialist tradition. I would call instead the orthodox socialist tradition. And the idea is to avoid all types of reforms and simply seize the state in order to rapidly break away with existing institutions. The second strategy would be the interstitial strategy, associated to the anarchist tradition as well as some Marxist or leftist tendencies today. And the idea is to avoid preoccupations over seizing the state, be it electorally or via vanguard party, and instead we should build alternative institutions in the margins of the system, such as worker cooperatives or other solidaristic ways of organizing communities and enterprises. Finally, the symbiotic strategy, which is associated to the social democratic tradition, which aims to obtain specific gains, such as improving the working class's condition, reducing inequality, with temporary class compromise. So the idea is to collaborate with the capitalist class instead of confronting it directly. Now, framing these transition strategies in these categories helped us to analyze them individually and see their strengths and weaknesses. For example, ruptural transition, Eric Olin Wright argues that the main problem is that there might be a transition trough. So the transition process will most likely reduce living standards, and that might lead to the population losing interest in the socialist transition, so the state would be, according to Wright, forced to turn to authoritarian practices. It should be noted that it's possible to ameliorate potential transition troughs in advanced capitalist countries. The economic surplus is large enough to ameliorate the trough, and in the periphery, given low living standards, it's not far-fetched to conceive a ruptural transition as resulting in rapid improvements in living standards, as for example occurred in Cuba. However, the persistence of an antagonistic local bourgeoisie or of hostile imperialist interventions, ranging from covert destabilization to military invasions, would likely undermine the effectiveness of ruptural transitions in diverse ways. Where democratic political institutions could easily become tools for destabilization policies, and turning to democratic centralist policies at a national level might hinder the democratic character of the revolution. The other strategy, the interstitial strategy, David Harvey calls it the thermite theory. Now, the idea is that alternative or non-capitalist forms of organizing firms and community could eat away at the institutional and material supports of capital until they collapse. And Harvey's critique is that as soon as the damage is obvious or threatening, then capital is both able and willing to call the exterminators, which is the state. An additional question, right, is if in fact these alternative institutions in the margins of the system are in fact capable of inflicting that damage in the first place. For example, worker cooperatives. For worker cooperatives to truly become anti-systemic institutions, they need to survive in market competition, and they need to survive without mimicking capitalist institutions, and they need to be linked with a broader movement aimed at socialist transition instead of simply being an isolated case. So we do see, or we do find evidence of a tendency of worker cooperatives towards not becoming anti-systemic institutions. For example, Mondragon, which is usually cited as a key example of successful cooperatives, it has no links with the broader transition movements, and it has consistently begun to mimic capitalist firms. Now, critics of this thermite theory from Marx and Engels to Harvey are not saying worker cooperatives are useless for the movement. On the contrary, I mean, they're well aware that cooperatives are very worthwhile for the movement. The main point is that in themselves they are insufficient for a socialist transition. Finally, we have the symbiotic strategy, which is to fight for all reforms in the state, which are adapted to raise the working classes and transform the state in the direction of democracy. Potential problems: the outcome is usually not the reform of capitalism, but the bankruptcy of reform. Paul Sweezy called this the law of capitalist politics. There's a clear trajectory of social democratic parties to shift from an orientation of gradually transforming capitalism to one of better managing it. And we find evidence of this across the world, from European social democracy to the pink tide in Latin America, excluding Venezuela, which is a particular case. Similarly, as soon as the damage is too obvious or too threatening, capital mounts a counteroffensive. It can be more aggressive in financing right-wing political campaigns or directly sabotaging the project. Thus, even where the anti-capitalist orientation is not necessarily abandoned, the strategy is always open to the possibility of right-wing parties winning elections and dismantling the project, which may be occurring right now in Venezuela. Now, I've taken all the three transition strategies and said why they don't work. Right? My conclusion is not that we have no opportunity and we don't have any strategies. The point is that these deficiencies that they have individually could be overcome through their combination. So state support for interstitial projects might allow them to survive and expand in a way that they actually pose a threat to the system. Conversely, interstitial projects may serve as focal points for radical educating, agitating, and organizing that may enable leftist parties to win and keep winning elections. Now, in combination, this interstitial and symbiotic strategy could enable phases of rupture with capitalist institutions. So we should aim for establishing or abolishing institutions in order to reduce the likelihood of the transition process being halted simply by right-wing electoral victory, or reduce the vulnerability to potential capitalist sabotage. For example, Bernie Sanders' symbiotic strategy may fail electorally, but it has served to agitate and educate around many issues. Sawant was successful electorally, and he has also used her position for agitating and educating. There are successful examples of worker cooperatives in practically every state. The opportunity for the left is found in combining these strategies at every level, with the objective of further fostering worker cooperatives or other alternative institutions, as well as to gain and maintain positions within the state. Now, my takeaway point from the presentation is that the goal should not be, our long-term goal should not be simply replacing neoliberalism with social democratic capitalism. That may be a first objective, but not the long-term goal. Our goal should be to enter Che's first period of construction. Now, at this initial stage, socialist and social democratic politics may overlap, but the importance is that from the start, we aim for the movement to be in the direction of that socialist transition rather than at stagnating in social democratic capitalism. Thank you.